And every time I get it, you say, well, it doesn't happen very often, but it's part of our democracy. It's part of our republic. It's one of your civic responsibilities. Now, out of the 6 times I've probably gotten that piece of paper, I show up each time, and I think if I remember right, probably like 3 or 4 times they say, don't even come, we figured it out, you don't even have to show up for jury duty. So there's that aspect. But there are other times where I've showed up and they said, we need you to fill out this little piece of paper. It's just like basic information. It's like, education level, income, profession, whatever. All of that's done because it's the lawyers on both sides that are picking who the jury's going to be. Now, based on a bunch of different factors, they're kind of looking for who might help them to win. Now, there was one time when I had jury duty where I showed up and they said, fill out this card and have a seat. It was me and about like 300 people in this room. And they told me, I said, we're going to trial, and we're going to need probably about 36 of you. And I remember thinking, I was like, okay, odds are in my favor. I'm probably going home. I sat down for like 10 minutes, and they called me. They said, you're one of the 36. Really? Okay, that's fine. So the 36 of us kind of got together, and the lawyer said, we need to interview each of you. We need to kind of find if you're who we're looking for. So I was a little bit late. I remember that. I was probably like halfway. And they said, all right, Mr. Nance, what's your profession? I said, I'm a teacher. They go, really? What do you teach? I said, history and law. They go, really? Wow, you're on this jury. I was like, really? Like, why? They go, don't worry about it. We're just looking for you. Thank you. Now, I will always remember this because it was the end of the summer. And I didn't want to be at a jury. I wanted to sit by the pool because it was summer. But it's my job. It's my responsibility. There was like 3 guys after me. I'll always remember this guy. He sits in the chair just like I did, but he was like barely sitting. He was like just holding on to consciousness. And he was in sweatpants and a ripped off sleeve shirt. And I remember being like, just like, when you wear sweatpants to jury duty, that's you like giving up on life. You're in sweatpants during the day, things aren't going well. I will always remember this guy because he's just sitting there like this. And the lawyer's asking him, it's like, Mr. Johnson, what's your profession? And he goes, I'm unemployed. And here I am being like, of course you are. And they're like, okay, Mr. Johnson, like, we got a few more questions. And he's just like, fine. I think his pen fell out too. He's like, fine. Like, he could not have been more just like ridiculous. And after like a few questions, I remember the lawyer just going, Mr. Johnson, I don't need you. Like, this is not gonna work out. And he just goes, okay, great, thank you very much, have a good day. And walks out. And I remember thinking that too, I was like, this guy, like, obviously didn't want to be at jury duty. Like, let me tell you, no one wants to be there. But it's part of your responsibility. Because this is what gives us power. It gives us power versus the state. If it was just the state allowed to determine guilt and innocence, it would be a huge blow to our republic. Jury duty is fantastically important. So I'll go ahead and tell you this. One day, you're going to get that little letter in the mail, and it's going to say, show up for jury duty. And let me just tell you this. It's probably not, it's going to be a hassle on your life. But it's part of our republic. It keeps our democracy going. Today, what we're going to talk about are going to be just really the steps about judges and juries and their responsibilities. Now, first up, we had talked before about how when the founders write out the Constitution, they put in there all these various protections. Because as they said, when you're facing the power of the state, you need the most protection you can get. One of those guarantees that they have is that you're going to have a jury from people in that community. They send out these letters to everyone in that community that's been chosen randomly for jury duty, and it's the jury that decides if you are guilty or not guilty. Thank you. I know it's pain. Now, when the jury hears the facts of the case, it's up to them to decide. Now, we've talked about this before. Do you remember? When it comes to a criminal case, what's the level of evidence that you need to have? Remember what that's called? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, I had you guys before kind of put down the number. How certain do you have to be to have beyond a reasonable doubt? Now, I had you guys just throw it out there because there's no right or wrong. It might be you have to be 100% certain, 95, whatever it is. If we're talking about a jury and how they decide guilt and innocence, it's all based on the facts that the lawyers present. Because usually, juries are made up of 12 people. Now, depending on a few different circumstances, it can change, but 12 is the normal number. With those 12 people, you need unanimous decisions. You need to be certain that all 12 say, yes, this person's guilty. If one of those jurors says that maybe they have concerns, maybe this person didn't do it, then it's a mistrial. That defendant could go free. They might retry it, as we talked about last time. The judge in this is really just kind of the referee. The judge is just there to say, he's there to really keep order, to keep the process in line. He's there as the one who is going to be making certain that prosecution and defense play by the rules. Now, I can tell you from my own personal experience, when I was on that one jury, we were there before even the lawyers of the defendant got there. We were there at the very first part of this process, and the judge was telling us, the person that you're going to meet today, the defendant, possibly committed this crime and this crime. And the judge said to us, I'm going to explain what these crimes are. And he basically gave us an explanation for what the law is. And he told us, your job is just determine if he broke one, both, or none of those laws, as I have interpreted it to you. That's it. I don't care what you think about that law. I don't care if you think it's a terrible law. It's just your job to determine if he broke that law. You are going to figure that out based on the facts. Now, when all is said and done, juries are the ones who decide the verdict. They decide guilty or not guilty. Now, this again, from personal experience, is kind of a weird thing about our judicial system. Our judicial system doesn't really have any rules for the jury. They are told, you guys just figure out guilt or not guilty. So when the case concluded for us, we went back into this little room. If I had to guess, I'd say it was about half the size of this room, with a table, 12 chairs, and a whiteboard. And that was basically it. And the judge just told us, he said, okay, you guys are now in deliberation. You decide if this person's guilty or not guilty. And I remember someone goes, well, how do we do that? What's the procedure? What are the rules? And the judge just said, there aren't any. You guys figure it out. And he just left and closed the door. Now, we had kind of been told before, you probably need a foreperson. You need someone to kind of run things. And I'll always remember this because this was just weird to me. Like right as he closed the door, someone said, okay, let's pick a foreperson. I guess we should vote on it. So they said, Mr. Nance, what was your profession again? I said, I'm a teacher. And they go, who votes for the teacher to be in charge? 11 hands go up. I was like, why? Like, why are you picking? Because I know how to work a whiteboard? Like, is that it? And they was like, no, like you're used to running people. I'm like, all right, fine, I'll be in charge. So here I am. I just have this position, just by popular vote. And I thought, I don't know what to do. So I just said, okay, well, let's just start with this. Said, what do you think? And they just kind of said what they thought. I go, okay, what do you think? And they just started talking. So then after about 20 minutes of this, we started writing facts down on the whiteboard. We started like drawing out diagrams. We just kind of did as best we could. We just sort of put everything together. We deliberated for, let me see if I remember right. I think it was about like 6 hours. And after 6 hours, we went to the judge. And we said, Judge, we can't get an agreement. We're a hung jury. And he just came back and he said, not yet, get back in there. So, okay. So we went back in. We talked some more. One person changed their vote. We deliberated for like 4 more hours. Came out and we said, Judge, we're still a hung jury. He goes, okay, I'll accept that now. That's just how it works. There's no real rules to it. But if you are on one of those sides where you can get a guilty verdict, then it's time for the judge for sentencing. Now, I should say this too. For sentencing, there are some crimes where it is a mandatory minimum sentence. If you're guilty of this, you have to serve this time. Some have maximum penalties. You cannot serve more than this. But it's really up to the judge. He gets to decide what that punishment's going to be. Now, in some instances, juries can suggest punishments. They can say, based on what we've heard, we suggest life in prison. The judge doesn't have to take that into account. It's all on him. He gets to decide because he has original jurisdiction. He gets to hear the case first. So original jurisdiction is when the facts come out. When you determine guilt or not guilty. That's original. Now we're going to talk a little bit later about the other kind of jurisdiction. Yes, Mark?
Is it possible for the judge to ever overrule what the jury, what they come to the decision, the verdict?
He can't overturn the verdict, but let me tell you this. There's such thing as what's called a bench trial, where there is no jury. It's just the judge decides guilty or not guilty. But he can't overturn the jury. That's not his role. Now, with that said, I want to kind of build upon this because when I saw you guys last time and we were talking about comparing civil and criminal, we got to talk about a couple other things that come with that. So let me just tell you this. This next slide are going to be some things to build upon this, but I also just kind of want to get these kind of this verbiage sort of out of the way because there's one last thing we're going to talk about after that. So first, when we're talking about when the judge makes his decisions, we have verdicts and we have judgments. In a criminal case, you get a verdict from the jury. They say either guilty or not guilty. Now, with that said, we were talking before about some differences between criminal and civil. We had just talked about how in criminal, you need beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to remember, in civil, 51%, you're absolutely right. What do we call that, though? You got to have, your hand starts with P. So, preponderance of evidence. Hopefully that's ringing the bell. In civil, you just need 51%. You need preponderance of evidence. This is called the judgment. In a civil case, you get a judgment, you get a decision. Now, Melanie, you're kind of one step ahead of me because in a civil case, oftentimes it's just a judge that determines who has 51% of the evidence. It can be a jury. You can get one in a civil case, but it has to kind of fulfill some specific things. So more often than not, in civil, it's just a judge making the decision. Now, before I go on, these things are basically the same thing. It's the decision. But you got to be certain you have it straight. Verdict for criminal, judgment for civil. Are we good so far? Okay. There is something else that I just want to put out there. Because I think this is probably the best place to put this, but it's kind of a different idea. So let me explain. A judge can also issue an injunction. Now, an injunction can kind of take 2 different forms. So I want to explain those forms in just a little bit. But I do just want to give you the basics. An injunction is when the court orders you or a company or something to not do something, to stop doing something. Now, I do kind of want to give you some examples because I know this is sort of a strange concept. I want to give you one example as a restraining order is an injunction. Now, an injunction or a restraining order simply says this person does not have or cannot be within a certain amount of distance from this person or place. Now, I kind of just use this example